Hi, I'm Natalie. Last Tuesday, I watched my 8-year-old son Tyler hit the concrete basement floor after my father shoved him down 12 wooden steps. When I screamed and demanded we leave immediately, my mother, a Pentagon General with 30 years of military command, looked me dead in the eye and said Tyler deserved it for disrespecting his grandfather. I packed our things in silence, drove home, and filed a police report. This morning, I woke up to military police at my apartment door with orders from my mother's office. So what changed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The smell of my mother's pot roast had filled the Fairfax County house for hours, mixing with the scent of pine from her meticulously decorated Christmas tree. Tyler had been bouncing between the kitchen and living room all afternoon, chattering about his school's upcoming winter concert where he'd be playing the triangle. At 8 years old, he had this infectious energy that usually made even the grumpiest adults crack a smile. Usually. My father Frank sat in his leather recliner, the same spot he'd claimed for 25 years, nursing his third beer and watching some old war documentary with the volume cranked too high. The remote control rested on the chair's arm like a scepter, and God help anyone who dared touch it without permission. Tyler had learned this lesson the hard way during previous visits, but today something was different. Today, my father seemed particularly agitated, his jaw clenched tighter than normal, his responses to Tyler's innocent questions sharper and more dismissive. I should have seen the warning signs. The way Frank's knuckles whitened when Tyler accidentally bumped into his chair while chasing our old family cat Sergeant. The heavy sigh when Tyler asked if he could change the channel to see if any Christmas movies were on. The dangerous edge in his voice when he told Tyler to stop fidgeting and sit still like a proper young man should. But I was busy helping my mother in the kitchen, trying to navigate the complex dance of staying in her good graces while keeping Tyler entertained and out of trouble. General Patricia Kellerman ran her household like a military operation, and Sunday dinners were no exception. Everything had its place, every person had their role, and deviation from the established order was not tolerated. My brother Derek, now a captain following dutifully in our mother's footsteps, sat at the dining room table reviewing some paperwork he'd brought home from Fort Belvoir. My sister Stephanie perched on the couch near Frank, scrolling through real estate listings on her tablet, while occasionally laughing at whatever was happening on the television screen. The family hierarchy had always been crystal clear. Derek was the golden child, destined for military greatness and my mother's obvious pride. Stephanie was Frank's favorite, the baby girl who could do no wrong, and whose bubbly personality seemed to charm everyone effortlessly. And then there was me, the middle child, who'd chosen nursing over the military, single motherhood over an advantageous marriage, and independence over family approval. Tyler, by extension, occupied an even more precarious position as the grandson who represented all of my questionable life choices. When Tyler wandered back into the living room after dinner, his small hands still slightly sticky from the apple pie my mother had reluctantly allowed him to eat without finishing all his vegetables, I noticed Frank's expression darken. Tyler approached the coffee table where a deck of cards lay scattered from an earlier game between Derek and Stephanie. With the innocent curiosity that defined him, Tyler reached for the cards, probably hoping someone might teach him a new game or let him practice the card tricks his friend Marcus had shown him at school. That's when Frank's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Don't touch those." The words carried a weight that made everyone freeze. Tyler's hand hovered over the cards, uncertainty flickering across his young face. He looked toward me, seeking guidance. But before I could say anything, Frank continued, "Didn't your mother teach you any manners? You don't touch other people's things without asking." The accusation stung, not just because of its harshness, but because of its implication. Frank wasn't just criticizing Tyler. He was criticizing my parenting, my ability to raise a respectful child, my worthiness as a daughter and mother. I felt the familiar heat rise in my chest, the same feeling I'd experienced countless times throughout my childhood, when Frank's criticism cut deeper than it should have. But this time, it wasn't just about me. This time, he was targeting my son. "Tyler, come here, sweetheart," I said gently, trying to diffuse the tension before it escalated further. But Tyler, being 8 and not fully understanding the complex family dynamics at play, made what would prove to be a fatal mistake. Instead of immediately obeying, he turned to Frank with the kind of earnest sincerity that children possess and asked, "Grandpa, why are you always so angry when I'm here?" The question hung in the air like a live grenade. Derek looked up from his paperwork, finally sensing the shift in atmosphere. Stephanie stopped scrolling through her tablet. My mother emerged from the kitchen, drawn by the sudden silence that had replaced the usual background chatter. And Frank's face transformed into something I'd only seen a few times before, usually right before someone in our family ended up crying or storming out of the house. "What did you just say to me?" Frank's voice was dangerously quiet, the kind of quiet that preceded explosions. Tyler, realizing he'd somehow crossed a line but not understanding how, took a small step backward. His lower lip began to tremble, and I could see the confusion and fear building in his dark eyes. "I just meant," Tyler started, but Frank was already rising from his chair, his 6-foot frame towering over my small son. The movement was deliberate, intimidating, designed to make Tyler feel as small and powerless as possible. I'd seen this tactic before, used on me and my siblings whenever Frank decided we needed to be reminded of our place in the family hierarchy. "You meant to disrespect me in my own house," Frank said, stepping closer to Tyler. "You meant to show me what kind of ungrateful, mouthy kid your mother is raising. That's what you meant." I couldn't stay silent anymore. "Dad, he's just a child, he didn't mean anything by it." But my intervention only seemed to fuel Frank's anger further. He turned his glare toward me, and I saw something in his expression that made my stomach drop. This wasn't just about Tyler's innocent question. This was about years of accumulated resentment, disappointment, and disapproval that Frank had been storing up like ammunition. "Of course you'd defend him," Frank said, his voice dripping with disgust. "Just like you defend every poor choice you've made. Look at what you've created, Natalie. A disrespectful little brat, who thinks he can talk to adults however he wants." The room felt charged with electricity, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. My mother stood in the kitchen doorway, her expression unreadable, but her posture rigid, with the kind of military bearing that had defined her entire adult life. Derek had set down his paperwork completely now, watching the scene unfold with the detached interest of someone observing a training exercise. Stephanie had shrunk back into the couch cushions, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Tyler, caught in the crossfire of adult emotions he couldn't possibly understand, began to cry. Not the dramatic, attention-seeking tears that some children deploy when they want something, but the quiet, heartbroken sobs of a child who knows he's in trouble but doesn't understand why. The sound of his crying seemed to push Frank past whatever internal boundary had been containing his rage. "Stop that crying right now," Frank commanded, pointing a finger at Tyler's face. "Real men don't cry over nothing. Your grandfather never let me cry, and I turned out fine." But Tyler couldn't stop crying. The combination of fear, confusion, and hurt had overwhelmed his 8-year-old emotional regulation system, and the tears kept flowing, despite Frank's increasingly aggressive demands that he stop. Each sob seemed to enrage Frank further, and I watched in growing horror as my father's face grew redder and his hands clenched into fists. "I said, stop crying," Frank repeated, his voice now loud enough to rattle the windows. When Tyler continued to sob, Frank took another step forward, bringing himself directly into Tyler's personal space. "Maybe you need to learn some respect the hard way." That's when I knew I had to act. I moved toward Tyler, intending to scoop him up and remove him from the situation before it could escalate further. But Frank's hand shot out, grabbing my wrist with enough force to leave marks. "Don't you dare," he hissed. "This is between me and him. You've coddled this kid long enough." The physical contact, the sight of finger-shaped bruises already forming on my wrist, the realization that Frank was prepared to use force to maintain control over the situation, all of it crystallized into a moment of absolute clarity. This had gone far beyond a family disagreement or generational differences in parenting styles. This had become dangerous. "Let go of me," I said quietly, but with steel in my voice that surprised even me. "And step away from my son." Frank's grip tightened instead of loosening. "Your son needs to learn some respect, and if you won't teach him, I will." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion and lightning speed simultaneously. Frank released my wrist and lunged toward Tyler, who instinctively stumbled backward to avoid the approaching threat. But Tyler was standing near the top of the basement stairs, the wooden steps that led down to Frank's workshop and storage area. As he stumbled backward, Tyler's small body hit the door frame, and his feet slipped on the polished hardwood floor. The basement door, which had been standing open because Frank had been down there earlier retrieving Christmas decorations, became a gaping mouth waiting to swallow my son. Tyler's arms windmilled frantically as he tried to regain his balance, but gravity and momentum had already taken control. I lunged forward, my hand outstretched, desperate to catch him before he fell. But Frank moved faster. Instead of helping Tyler regain his balance, instead of grabbing him to prevent the fall, Frank placed both hands on Tyler's small chest and pushed. The motion was deliberate, forceful, and devastating. Tyler's eyes widened in shock and terror as he realized what was happening, and then he was gone, tumbling down 12 wooden steps to land with a sickening thud on the concrete basement floor.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The sound of Tyler's body hitting the concrete will haunt me for the rest of my life. It was a sound that contained everything: the betrayal of trust, the shattering of innocence, the crossing of a line that could never be uncrossed. For a moment that felt like eternity, the house was completely silent, except for the echo of impact. Then Tyler started screaming. Not crying, screaming. The kind of screams that speak to every maternal instinct, every protective nerve, every fear that lives in the dark corners of a parent's mind. I flew down those stairs faster than I'd ever moved in my life, my nursing training kicking in as I assessed Tyler for injuries while simultaneously trying to comfort him. Blood was streaming from a gash on his forehead where he'd hit one of the wooden steps. His left wrist was already swelling, bent at an angle that made my stomach lurch. But worse than the visible injuries was the look in his eyes, a combination of physical pain, emotional trauma, and complete bewilderment that his own grandfather had deliberately hurt him. "It's okay, baby. Mommy's here," I whispered, carefully checking for signs of head injury or spinal damage while Tyler sobbed against my chest. Above us, I could hear movement, voices, the sound of feet on the floor overhead. But no one came down the stairs. No one rushed to help. No one seemed to share my panic about Tyler's condition. When I finally carried Tyler back upstairs, his blood staining my sweater and his small body trembling with shock, I expected to find a family in crisis. I expected concern, remorse, perhaps even someone calling 911. Instead, I found Frank back in his recliner, calmly sipping his beer as if nothing had happened. Derek was once again absorbed in his paperwork. Stephanie was back to scrolling through her tablet, though she at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. And my mother, General Patricia Kellerman, stood in the center of the room with her arms crossed and an expression of cold disapproval on her face. Not disapproval directed at Frank for what he'd done, but disapproval directed at me for making such a fuss about it. "He shouldn't have been disrespectful," she said simply, as if those words explained and justified everything that had just happened. "Children need to learn there are consequences for their actions." I stared at her in disbelief, Tyler still crying softly in my arms, blood from his head wound dripping onto the hardwood floor that Frank was so proud of keeping spotless. "He's 8 years old," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "He asked a question. He's a child." "He's a child who needs discipline," my mother replied, her tone carrying the same authority she used when briefing Pentagon officials. "Frank did what needed to be done. If you'd been doing your job as a parent, it wouldn't have been necessary." The casual cruelty of her words, the complete absence of concern for Tyler's well-being, the implicit support for Frank's violent actions, all of it hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about different parenting philosophies or generational gaps in understanding. This was about a family system that had normalized violence and emotional abuse to such an extent that pushing an 8-year-old down a flight of stairs could be dismissed as appropriate discipline. I looked around the room one more time, searching for any sign of human decency, any indication that someone in my family recognized the horror of what had just occurred. But Derek continued his paperwork. Stephanie avoided eye contact. Frank sipped his beer. And my mother maintained her position that Tyler had deserved what happened to him. "We're leaving," I said quietly, adjusting Tyler's weight in my arms as I prepared to carry him out of that house forever. "Good," Frank called from his chair without looking up from the television. "Maybe next time the boy will think twice before running his mouth." I didn't respond. I didn't argue. I didn't try to explain why what had happened was wrong, because clearly no explanation would penetrate the wall of justification they'd built around Frank's actions. Instead, I gathered Tyler's jacket and my purse, carried my injured son to the car, and drove straight to the emergency room at Children's Hospital of Richmond. The medical staff were thorough and professional, treating Tyler's injuries while asking careful questions about how the accident had occurred. I stuck to the basic facts. He fell down basement stairs, without elaborating on the circumstances. Tyler received 5 stitches for the gash on his forehead and had his sprained wrist wrapped and immobilized. The attending physician, Dr. Martinez, recommended follow-up appointments and warned me to watch for signs of concussion over the next several days. But it was the social worker who appeared after Tyler's medical treatment that made me realize the gravity of the situation. Linda Torres introduced herself gently, explaining that any injury to a child involving stairs or potential head trauma required a brief assessment to ensure the child's safety and well-being. "Can you tell me exactly how Tyler was injured?" she asked, her voice kind but professional. I found myself at a crossroads. I could continue with the sanitized version of events, protecting my family's reputation and avoiding the complications that would inevitably follow a more complete disclosure. Or I could tell the truth about what Frank had done and face whatever consequences came with that decision. Tyler made the choice for me. Still groggy from the pain medication and exhausted from the trauma, he looked up at Linda Torres with his bandaged head and said, "Grandpa pushed me down the stairs because I asked why he was angry." The simple, matter-of-fact statement from an 8-year-old carried more weight than any elaborate explanation I could have provided. Linda Torres' expression shifted subtly, and I knew there would be no going back from this moment. The truth was out, and it would have to be dealt with. Over the next 2 hours, I found myself recounting the entire incident in detail to Linda Torres, to a police officer who arrived to take a report, and to hospital administrators who needed to document the case. Each telling felt like reliving the horror, but also like lifting a weight from my shoulders. For the first time in my life, I was speaking the complete truth about my family's dysfunction instead of making excuses or minimizing the damage. By the time Tyler and I finally made it home to our small apartment in Falls Church, it was nearly midnight. Tyler fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted by the day's trauma and the medication. I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea, staring at the police report number written on a card the officer had given me, trying to process everything that had happened. My phone had been buzzing intermittently throughout the evening, but I'd ignored it while dealing with Tyler's medical care and the official reports. Now, in the quiet of my apartment, I finally looked at the messages. There were several texts from Derek, all variations of, "Mom wants to know if you're filing charges." There was a voicemail from Stephanie asking if Tyler was okay, but also suggesting that maybe I was overreacting. And there were 3 missed calls from my mother, with no accompanying messages. I didn't respond to any of them. What was there to say? That my father had deliberately injured my child, and my family's primary concern was whether I would pursue legal consequences. That the people who were supposed to love and protect Tyler had instead blamed him for his own victimization. That 36 years of living in that family system had finally shown me what it really was. Instead, I opened my laptop and began documenting everything I could remember about the incident. The exact sequence of events, the words that were spoken, the injuries Tyler sustained, the family's reactions. My nursing training had taught me the importance of thorough documentation, and some instinct told me I would need a detailed record of what had happened. As I typed, I realized this wasn't the first time Frank had been physically aggressive with Tyler. There had been other incidents. Grabbing Tyler's arm too roughly when he was misbehaving, yanking him by the shoulder to move him away from something, using excessive force during what he called roughhousing. I'd minimized these incidents at the time, telling myself they were just generational differences in how men interacted with children. But looking back with clear eyes, I could see the pattern of escalating aggression that had culminated in Tyler being pushed down the stairs. I also began to remember my own childhood differently. The times Frank had grabbed me hard enough to leave bruises. The occasions when his anger had crossed the line from discipline into abuse. The family's consistent response of minimizing, justifying, and ultimately forgetting these incidents until they became part of an accepted pattern rather than isolated problems. The documentation process took hours, but it felt necessary and therapeutic. For the first time, I was creating an official record of family dysfunction, instead of participating in the collective amnesia that had allowed it to continue for so long. When I finally finished and saved the document, the sun was beginning to rise over Falls Church, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of clarity about what needed to happen next. I called in sick to work, arranged for Tyler to stay home from school, and made an appointment with a family attorney who specialized in cases involving child welfare and domestic violence. Robert Chang had been recommended by Linda Torres, and his office could see me that afternoon. Tyler spent the morning resting on the couch, his bandaged head propped up on pillows, while he watched cartoons and worked his way through a bowl of his favorite cereal. He seemed remarkably resilient, as children often are, but I caught him touching his forehead gently and wincing when he moved his wrist. The physical injuries would heal, but I worried about the emotional impact of being deliberately hurt by someone he'd trusted. When I asked Tyler how he was feeling about what had happened, he was quiet for a long moment before saying, "I don't think Grandpa likes me very much." The simple statement broke my heart, not just for its sadness, but for its accuracy. Frank had never shown any genuine affection for Tyler, had never seemed to enjoy his company or take pride in his accomplishments. Tyler, with the intuitive wisdom that children possess, had recognized this rejection long before I'd been willing to acknowledge it. Sometimes grown-ups have problems that make it hard for them to be kind, I told Tyler carefully. What Grandpa did was wrong, and it wasn't your fault. You didn't do anything to deserve being hurt. Tyler nodded solemnly, accepting this explanation with the same matter-of-fact approach he'd used when telling the social worker what had happened. But I could see questions forming in his young mind. Questions about family and safety, and why people who were supposed to love you might hurt you instead. The meeting with Robert Chang was illuminating and terrifying in equal measure. He explained the legal options available to us, the likely timeline for any proceedings, and the potential consequences for Frank if charges were pursued. He also warned me about the family dynamics I could expect. The pressure to drop charges, the attempts to paint me as an overprotective mother, the ways family members might try to manipulate the situation to protect Frank and preserve the family's reputation. In my experience, Robert Chang said carefully, military families often have additional complications when dealing with these situations. There can be concerns about how charges might affect security clearances or career advancement. Be prepared for your family to view this not just as a personal matter, but as a threat to professional standing. His warning proved prophetic. That evening, as Tyler slept peacefully in his bed for the first time since the incident, my phone rang. The caller ID showed my mother's number, but when I answered, the voice on the other end was crisp, official, and utterly cold. "Natalie, this is General Kellerman," my mother said, as if she were addressing a subordinate rather than her own daughter. "I'm calling to inform you that formal charges against your father would be extremely ill-advised. There are considerations here that extend beyond your personal feelings about what happened. The formal tone, the use of her rank, the implicit threat hidden in her words. All of it confirmed that my mother had made her choice. She was prepared to use every resource at her disposal to protect Frank and maintain the family's image, regardless of what that meant for Tyler or me. "Tyler was hurt, Mom," I said quietly. "Badly hurt. Dad pushed him down those stairs deliberately." "Tyler fell because he wasn't being careful," my mother replied without missing a beat. "Children get injured, it happens. But destroying this family over an accident would be a mistake you'd regret for the rest of your life." The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that I could see how it had worked for so many years. My mother's ability to reframe reality, To present her version of events with such authority and conviction had trained our entire family to doubt their own perceptions rather than challenge her narrative. But I wasn't the same person who had grown up in that house, learning to accept whatever version of truth my parents presented. I was a mother now, with responsibilities that extended beyond maintaining family peace. I was a healthcare professional who understood the difference between accidents and deliberate harm. And I was finally angry enough to stop protecting people who had never protected me or my son. "It wasn't an accident," I said firmly, "and I won't pretend it was to make you more comfortable." The silence that followed stretched for nearly a minute. When my mother spoke again, her voice had dropped to the tone she usually reserved for delivering ultimatums to Pentagon officials who had disappointed her. "I sincerely hope you'll reconsider this course of action, Natalie. For everyone's sake." The line went dead, leaving me alone with the distinct impression that my family had just declared war on me and Tyler. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of that war. I was ready for it. The next morning brought an unwelcome surprise that shattered any illusions I might have had about my family's willingness to handle this situation quietly. Tyler was still asleep when the sharp knock echoed through our small apartment at exactly 7:30 a.m. Military precision, I thought grimly, recognizing the authoritative cadence that could only come from people accustomed to being obeyed without question. Through the peephole, I saw two figures in crisp uniforms standing in the narrow hallway outside my door. Military police, their posture rigid and official, holding what appeared to be official documentation. My heart rate spiked as I realized the implications. My mother hadn't just threatened consequences the night before. She had already set them in motion. I opened the door slowly, keeping the chain latch engaged, and looked at the two MPs through the narrow gap. The senior officer, a stern-faced woman with sergeant stripes, held up a folder containing what I could see were official papers with multiple seals and signatures. "Ma'am, we need to speak with Natalie Brooks regarding official military business," she said in the kind of voice that brooked no argument. "We have documentation here that requires your immediate attention." "What kind of documentation?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. My mother's reach within military circles was extensive, and her willingness to use that influence to protect Frank had become crystal clear during our phone conversation. "Ma'am, we'd prefer to discuss this inside, if you don't mind," the second MP said, his tone polite but firm. "This is a matter that requires privacy and discretion." I glanced back toward Tyler's bedroom, where I could hear him starting to stir. The last thing I wanted was for him to wake up to military police in our living room, but I also knew that refusing to speak with them would likely escalate the situation in ways I couldn't predict or control. "Give me 5 minutes," I said, closing the door and quickly checking on Tyler. He was sitting up in bed, rubbing his eyes and looking confused by the unfamiliar voices in the apartment. "Mommy, who's here?" he asked, his voice still thick with sleep. The bandage on his forehead looked stark white against his dark hair, a visible reminder of everything that had happened. "Some people who need to talk to Mommy about grown-up things," I told him gently. "Why don't you stay in here and watch cartoons on the tablet while I handle this? I'll make pancakes when they leave." Tyler nodded, apparently satisfied with this explanation, and I helped him get settled with his tablet and a cup of water before returning to the front door. Taking a deep breath, I unlatched the chain and opened the door fully, stepping aside to allow the two MPs into my modest living room. They looked around briefly, their trained eyes taking in the details of our humble apartment. The second-hand furniture, the children's toys scattered around, the small kitchen visible through the doorway. I could see them cataloging everything, forming impressions about our living situation and financial status that would undoubtedly find their way into whatever report they were preparing. "Mrs. Brooks," the female sergeant began, consulting her paperwork. "I'm Sergeant Williams, and this is Corporal Johnson. We're here on behalf of General Patricia Kellerman, regarding allegations that have been made involving her husband, Frank Kellerman." The formal phrasing made my stomach clench. Even in this official context, they were framing Frank as my mother's husband, rather than as Tyler's grandfather or my father. It was a subtle way of emphasizing the military connection while downplaying the family relationship that made this situation so complicated. "We understand you filed a police report alleging that Mr. Kellerman assaulted your son," Sergeant Williams continued, her expression neutral but watchful. General Kellerman has asked us to inform you that these allegations, if pursued, could have serious implications for ongoing military operations and security protocols. The threat was delivered with professional courtesy, but it was unmistakably a threat nonetheless. My mother was using her position and influence to pressure me into dropping the charges against Frank, and she was doing it through official military channels to add weight and legitimacy to her intimidation tactics. Are you saying that my father's assault on my 8-year-old son is somehow related to national security? I asked, unable to keep the disbelief out of my voice. Corporal Johnson shifted slightly, his discomfort with the situation becoming more apparent. Ma'am, we're simply conveying information as requested by a superior officer. General Kellerman wanted you to be aware of the potential complications that could arise from pursuing criminal charges in this matter. What kind of complications? I pressed, though I was beginning to understand that this visit was more about psychological pressure than actual legal threats. Sergeant Williams consulted her paperwork again, though I suspected she had memorized whatever talking points my mother had provided. Military families often have access to sensitive information and security clearances that can be affected by criminal proceedings involving family members. There could be implications for career advancement, housing allowances, medical benefits, and other military privileges. The message was clear even though it was delivered in bureaucratic language. If I continued to pursue charges against Frank, my mother would ensure that there were professional consequences for other family members. Derek's military career could be impacted. Housing and healthcare benefits that extended to family members might be reviewed or revoked. The institutional power of the military would be leveraged against me and Tyler to protect Frank from accountability. I see, I said carefully, trying to process the full scope of what my mother was threatening. And what exactly is General Kellerman proposing I do with this information? The two MPs exchanged a glance, and I could see that they were uncomfortable with being used as messengers in what was clearly a family dispute rather than a legitimate military matter. But orders were orders, especially when they came from a Pentagon General with the kind of influence my mother wielded. General Kellerman hopes that you'll consider the broader implications of your decisions, Sergeant Williams said diplomatically. She wanted to ensure you had all the relevant information before proceeding with any formal complaints or legal actions. And if I choose to proceed anyway? I asked, though I was fairly certain I already knew the answer. That would be your decision to make, ma'am, Corporal Johnson said quickly, clearly eager to distance himself from any appearance of threatening a civilian. We're just here to deliver information, not to influence your choices. But the influence was already there, woven into every word of their carefully scripted message. My mother had calculated exactly how to use her military position to maximum effect, employing official channels and uniformed personnel to deliver threats that would carry far more weight than a simple phone call or family confrontation. After the MPs left, I sat in my kitchen staring at the business card Sergeant Williams had given me, which contained contact information for my mother's office at the Pentagon. The card felt heavy in my hands, like a physical manifestation of the institutional power being deployed against me and Tyler. I thought about Derek, whose military career had always been his primary identity and source of pride. Would my mother really sabotage her own son's advancement to protect Frank? The answer, I realized with growing clarity, was probably yes. My mother's loyalty had always been to the institution and the hierarchy, not to individual family members who threatened that structure. I thought about Stephanie, whose bubbly personality masked a deep need for family approval and financial security. How would she react when she realized that my pursuit of justice for Tyler might affect her access to family resources or her standing within the social circles that mattered to her? And I thought about Tyler, still watching cartoons in his bedroom, blissfully unaware that his grandfather's violence had triggered a complex web of institutional retaliation designed to pressure his mother into silence. He shouldn't have to understand that seeking justice for his injuries would be treated as a betrayal of family loyalty rather than a reasonable response to deliberate harm. The phone rang while I was making pancakes, and Carmen Rodriguez's voice provided a welcome contrast to the morning's military formality. Carmen had been my closest friend since nursing school, and her warm, no-nonsense approach to life had helped me navigate countless personal and professional challenges over the years. "Girl, you sound terrible," Carmen said without preamble. "What's going on?" I found myself pouring out the entire story. Frank's assault on Tyler, the family's response, the military police visit, and my growing realization that pursuing justice would mean going to war with people who had significantly more institutional power than I did. Carmen listened without interruption until I finished, then was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Nat, I've known you for 15 years, and I've watched you make excuses for that family's dysfunction the entire time. But this isn't about family dynamics anymore. This is about child abuse." Her blunt assessment cut through the fog of confusion and intimidation that had been clouding my judgment. Carmen was right. I'd spent so many years normalizing my family's harmful behavior that I was still instinctively looking for ways to minimize or excuse what had happened to Tyler. "I know that," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "But you don't understand the kind of pressure they can bring to bear. My mother has connections and influence that could make our lives very difficult." "So what's the alternative?" Carmen asked. "You drop the charges, pretend nothing happened, and hope Frank doesn't hurt Tyler again the next time you're forced to interact? You teach your son that family loyalty is more important than his safety and well-being?" The question struck at the heart of my internal conflict. Protecting Tyler from further harm had to be my primary concern, but I was struggling to determine whether pursuing charges would actually accomplish that goal or simply escalate the family conflict in ways that would ultimately hurt Tyler more. "There's something else," Carmen continued, her voice taking on the tone she used when delivering difficult news to families in the hospital. "I've been thinking about what you told me, and I'm wondering if there might be documentation of other incidents involving Frank's behavior." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I knew where this conversation was heading. "Think about it, Nat. You work in pediatrics. You know how to recognize signs of abuse and neglect. You've probably filed reports about suspicious injuries in children. But when it comes to your own family, you've been trained to look the other way." Carmen's observation forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. As a pediatric nurse, I was mandated to report suspected child abuse, and had done so numerous times throughout my career. I'd seen the warning signs, understood the patterns, and knew how to document evidence of deliberate harm versus accidental injury. But when it came to my own family, I'd consistently applied different standards and made excuses for behavior that I would never have tolerated in other contexts. Tyler's injuries weren't the first incident, I admitted reluctantly. There have been other times when Frank was rougher than he should have been, when he used more force than necessary. I always told myself he was just old-fashioned about discipline. "And now?" Carmen prompted gently. "Now I'm wondering how many other children Frank might have hurt over the years," I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. How many times my mother might have used her influence to cover up or minimize incidents that should have been reported. The conversation with Carmen crystallized something that had been forming in my mind since the MP's visit. This wasn't just about Tyler or even about my immediate family anymore. If Frank had a pattern of violent behavior toward children, and if my mother was willing to use military resources to protect him from consequences, then there might be other victims whose experiences had been similarly suppressed or ignored. That afternoon, while Tyler napped with his injured wrist propped on pillows, I began making phone calls. First to Linda Torres, the social worker who had interviewed us at the hospital, to inform her about the military police visit and ask about the implications for Tyler's case. Linda's response was immediate and concerning. "Natalie, what you're describing sounds like witness intimidation, regardless of who's doing it or what uniform they're wearing. A Pentagon General doesn't get to use military personnel to discourage civilian reports of child abuse." Her frank assessment was both reassuring and terrifying. It was good to have confirmation that my mother's tactics were inappropriate and potentially illegal, but it also meant that the situation was more serious than I'd initially realized. "What happens now?" I asked Linda, dreading the answer but needing to understand the full scope of what Tyler and I were facing. "Now we document everything," Linda said firmly. "Every contact, every threat, every attempt to pressure you into dropping charges. This kind of intimidation actually strengthens the case rather than weakening it. because it suggests consciousness of guilt and a pattern of using power to avoid accountability. Next, I called Robert Chang to inform him about the morning's visit and ask about legal protections for Tyler and me. His response was swift and professional. Within 2 hours, he had filed motions for protective orders and had initiated contact with federal authorities who had jurisdiction over military personnel threatening civilians. "Your mother may have overplayed her hand," Robert told me during our phone conversation. "Using military resources for personal intimidation is a serious violation of federal law. She's opened herself up to scrutiny that extends far beyond the original assault charges against your father." The legal maneuvering felt surreal, like watching someone else's life unfold on television rather than living through my own reality. But I was beginning to understand that this case would ultimately be about much more than Frank's assault on Tyler. It would be about accountability for people who had used institutional power to cover up personal wrongdoing, and about whether military rank and family connections could insulate someone from the consequences of child abuse. That evening, as I helped Tyler with his physical therapy exercises for his injured wrist, my phone buzzed with a text message from Derek. The message was brief and formal, lacking any of the casual warmth that had characterized our relationship before this crisis erupted. "Mom asked me to reach out. Family meeting tomorrow at 1900 hours. Your presence is requested to discuss resolution of current situation." The military terminology and official tone told me everything I needed to know about how Derek was approaching this conflict. He wasn't reaching out as my brother who was concerned about his nephew's well-being. He was acting as my mother's messenger, conveying orders from a superior officer to a subordinate who was expected to comply without question. I stared at the message for several minutes, weighing my options. Attending the meeting would mean subjecting myself to coordinated family pressure designed to make me drop charges against Frank. It would mean sitting in that same living room where Tyler had been hurt, listening to justifications and minimizations from people who had already demonstrated their willingness to prioritize Frank's protection over Tyler's safety. But refusing to attend would likely escalate the conflict and might be portrayed as evidence of my unreasonableness or unwillingness to seek family resolution. My mother would undoubtedly frame my absence as proof that I was more interested in destroying the family than in finding reasonable solutions to the situation. I decided to attend, but on my own terms. I called Robert Chang and asked him to accompany me as legal counsel, both to ensure that anything discussed would be properly documented and to signal that I was taking this situation seriously enough to require professional representation. I also called Carmen and asked if she could stay with Tyler during the meeting. The last thing I wanted was to bring Tyler back into that house, and I knew that having Carmen there would ensure his safety and provide him with emotional support if the meeting didn't go well. The next evening, Robert and I arrived at my parents' house in Fairfax County at exactly 7 p.m. The military precision of the timing wasn't lost on me. My mother had trained our entire family to treat her schedule and preferences as non-negotiable commands, rather than requests open to discussion. The house looked exactly the same as it had 5 days earlier, when Tyler had been injured. The Christmas decorations were still perfectly arranged, the hardwood floors were still gleaming, and the basement door was now conspicuously closed and latched. But the atmosphere felt different, charged with tension and formal hostility that transformed the familiar space into something that felt more like a courtroom than a family home. Everyone was already assembled when we arrived. Frank sat in his usual recliner, though he avoided making eye contact when I entered the room. Derek occupied one end of the couch in his dress uniform, looking every inch the professional military officer. Stephanie perched nervously on the other end, clutching a tissue and shooting worried glances between Frank and my mother. General Patricia Kellerman stood near the fireplace in her full dress uniform, complete with ribbons and insignia that represented 30 years of military service and advancement. The formal attire was clearly intended to emphasize her authority and remind everyone present of the institutional power she represented. "Natalie," she said coolly, acknowledging my presence with a slight nod before turning her attention to Robert. "I wasn't aware you'd be bringing legal counsel to a family discussion. Given that military police visited my client yesterday morning with what appeared to be threats related to this family discussion, legal representation seemed prudent." Robert replied calmly, his tone professional but firm. The exchange set the tone for what followed, a carefully orchestrated presentation designed to pressure me into dropping charges while maintaining the appearance of reasonable family negotiation. My mother began with a speech about the importance of family unity and the devastating effects that public scandal could have on military careers and family reputation. Derek followed with statistics about the impact of criminal charges on military families, emphasizing the potential consequences for his own career advancement and the broader implications for family members who depended on military benefits and security clearances. Stephanie tearfully recounted her concerns about family dissolution and her hope that we could find a way to move forward without destroying the relationships that had sustained us through previous challenges. Frank remained silent throughout these presentations, but his presence in the room felt like a constant reminder of the violence that had precipitated this entire crisis. He occasionally nodded when someone made a point about the family's need to present a united front, but he never apologized for hurting Tyler or acknowledged that his actions had been inappropriate. Finally, my mother turned to me with the expression of someone who had presented a comprehensive case and expected immediate capitulation. "Natalie, you've heard from everyone about the broader implications of the choice you're facing. We're hoping you'll consider withdrawing the charges against your father and allowing the family to handle this matter privately." The phrase "handle this matter privately" echoed in my mind, carrying all the weight of decades of family dysfunction that had been covered up, minimized, and forgotten through exactly this kind of private handling. I thought about Tyler's frightened face as he tumbled down those stairs, about the blood streaming from his forehead, about his innocent question about why Grandpa was always angry. What exactly would private handling look like? I asked quietly. My mother's expression brightened slightly, apparently interpreting my question as a sign of willingness to negotiate. Frank would attend anger management counseling, family gatherings would have additional supervision to ensure everyone's comfort, and we'd all commit to moving forward with better communication and understanding. And Tyler? I asked. What would private handling look like for him? Tyler would continue to be part of the family, my mother said, though her tone suggested this was somehow a generous concession rather than a basic expectation. He'd learn appropriate boundaries and behavior for family interactions. The victim blaming inherent in her response confirmed everything I'd come to understand about my family's approach to accountability and change. Even in this formal setting, with legal counsel present and the full weight of criminal charges hanging over Frank's head, my mother was still suggesting that Tyler bore some responsibility for being pushed down the stairs. "No," I said simply, the word falling into the room like a stone into still water. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Derek shifted in his seat, his military bearing faltering slightly. Stephanie's tissue clutching intensified. Frank finally looked up from his hands, his expression unreadable but somehow threatening. "No?" my mother repeated, as if the word were foreign to her experience. "No, I won't withdraw the charges," I clarified, my voice steady despite the hammering of my heart. "Tyler was deliberately injured by someone who should have protected him, and your response has been to blame him for his own victimization, while threatening me for seeking appropriate accountability. Natalie, you're making a mistake that will destroy this family," my mother said, her tone shifting from diplomatic to authoritative. "The consequences of this decision will extend far beyond your personal satisfaction with seeing your father punished. The family was destroyed the moment Frank pushed Tyler down those stairs, and you chose to defend him instead of protecting your grandson," I replied, surprising myself with the clarity and firmness of my response. Robert had remained silent throughout the family presentations, but now he leaned forward slightly and addressed the room with professional courtesy. "I think it's important for everyone to understand that this isn't ultimately about family dynamics or personal relationships. A crime was committed against a child, it was reported to appropriate authorities, and the legal process will now proceed according to established protocols. This is still a family matter," quote, Derek interjected, speaking for the first time since we'd arrived. "There are ways to handle family conflicts without involving outside authorities or destroying people's careers and reputations." "Your nephew was pushed down a flight of stairs by your father," Robert replied calmly. "That stopped being a family matter and became a criminal matter the moment it happened. No amount of family unity or institutional pressure changes the legal facts of this case. The meeting continued for another hour, with various family members taking turns appealing to my sense of loyalty, threatening consequences for my decision, and attempting to reframe Frank's violence as a misunderstanding or accident that had been blown out of proportion by my maternal overprotectiveness. But something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of these people, and my relationship to them. For the first time in my life, I could see clearly how the family system functioned to protect perpetrators and silence victims. How institutional power was leveraged to avoid accountability, and how loyalty was weaponized to maintain harmful patterns of behavior. When Robert and I finally left that house, I felt a strange combination of relief and sadness. Relief that I'd been able to stand firm against coordinated family pressure and maintain my commitment to Tyler's safety and well-being. Sadness that it had taken my son being physically injured for me to fully comprehend how toxic and dysfunctional my family relationships had become. The drive back to Falls Church was quiet, with Robert occasionally making notes on his tablet while I processed the evening's events. As we pulled into my apartment complex, he turned to me with an expression of professional respect and personal concern. "Natalie, what you did tonight took tremendous courage," he said sincerely. Standing up to that kind of coordinated pressure, especially from family members and military authority figures, isn't easy. But you should know that your decision to prioritize Tyler's safety over family comfort is exactly what good parents do. His words meant more to me than he probably realized. For the first time since Tyler had been hurt, I felt confident that I was making the right choice, even though it meant accepting the loss of family relationships and facing whatever retaliation my mother might devise. When I got home, Carmen was reading on the couch while Tyler slept peacefully in his bed. She looked up expectantly as I entered, and I could see in her expression that she already knew how the meeting had gone. "They wanted you to drop the charges," she said, not really asking a question. "They wanted me to prioritize family loyalty over Tyler's safety," I corrected. "And when I refused, they made it clear that there would be consequences for that choice." "Good," Carmen said firmly. "Let them threaten you. Let them show everyone exactly who they really are, when they can't control the narrative anymore." As I checked on Tyler one more time before going to bed, I noticed that he was sleeping more peacefully than he had since the incident. His injured wrist was positioned carefully on the pillow, and the bandage on his forehead looked less stark against his skin. The physical injuries were healing, as I'd known they would. But more importantly, Tyler was sleeping in a home where his safety was the primary concern, where the adults responsible for his care prioritized his well-being over institutional reputation or family image. For the first time in his young life, he was truly protected from the toxic dynamics that had shaped my own childhood. That night, I began documenting everything that had happened during the family meeting. Every threat, every attempt at manipulation, every instance of victim blaming or minimization. The document was growing longer each day, but it was also becoming a comprehensive record of exactly why Tyler and I needed legal protection from people who claimed to love us. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, I knew. My mother's retaliation would likely escalate, and the legal process would continue to unfold with all its complexities and uncertainties. But tonight, Tyler was safe, and I was finally free from the burden of protecting people who had never protected us. The transformation had begun. The retaliation began exactly 72 hours after the family meeting, delivered with the precision and coordination that only someone with my mother's institutional connections could orchestrate. It started with a phone call to Children's Hospital of Richmond, where I'd worked in the pediatric ward for 8 years, building a reputation as a reliable and compassionate nurse. Nancy Fletcher, the head of nursing, called me at home on Thursday morning while Tyler was having breakfast. Her voice carried an unusual tension that immediately put me on alert, especially since she rarely contacted staff members at home unless there was a genuine emergency. "Natalie, I need you to come in this afternoon for a meeting with administration," Nancy said without her usual warm greeting. "There have been some concerns raised about your recent conduct, and we need to address them before your next scheduled shift." The carefully neutral language couldn't mask the seriousness of whatever had been reported about me. In 8 years of employment, I'd never been called in for a disciplinary meeting or had concerns raised about my professional conduct. My performance reviews had been consistently excellent, and I'd received commendations for my work with difficult cases and traumatized children. What kind of concerns? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the source of whatever allegations had been made. I'd prefer to discuss the details in person, Nancy replied diplomatically. Can you be here at 2 o'clock? Dr. Martinez will be joining us, along with someone from Human Resources. The inclusion of Dr. Martinez, the attending physician who had treated Tyler's injuries, told me everything I needed to know about the nature of these mysterious concerns. Someone had questioned my handling of Tyler's case, or suggested that I'd been less than truthful about the circumstances of his injuries. I called Robert Chang immediately after hanging up with Nancy, and his response was swift and decisive. Within an hour, he'd contacted the hospital's legal department to inform them that any disciplinary action taken against me in connection with Tyler's assault case would constitute retaliation and could expose the hospital to significant liability. They're trying to isolate you professionally, Robert explained during our phone conversation. If they can get you fired or disciplined at work, it undermines your credibility as a witness and makes you appear unstable or vindictive to anyone reviewing Tyler's case. The calculated nature of the attack was both impressive and terrifying. My mother hadn't just threatened consequences. She'd identified my professional vulnerability and moved to exploit it with surgical precision. Losing my job would devastate Tyler and me financially, but more importantly, it would signal to other potential supporters that associating with me carried professional risks. Carmen agreed to watch Tyler again while I attended the hospital meeting, and her anger on my behalf was palpable when I explained what was happening. This is insane, Nat. You're one of the best nurses in that department. Everyone knows how much you care about those kids. Caring about kids is exactly what got me into this situation, I replied, though I meant it as a statement of pride rather than regret. And apparently it's what's going to get me into even more trouble. The meeting at Children's Hospital felt like a tribunal designed to intimidate rather than investigate. Nancy Fletcher sat at the head of the conference table, flanked by Dr. Martinez and Sharon Webb from Human Resources. The formal seating arrangement and the presence of a recording device made it clear that this wasn't a casual conversation about workplace concerns. Natalie, we've received information suggesting that you may have filed false reports about your son's injuries in order to pursue a personal vendetta against family members, Sharon Webb began, reading from prepared notes. These allegations call into question your professional judgment and your fitness to work with vulnerable pediatric patients. The accusation was so outrageous that I almost laughed, except that the serious expressions around the table made it clear that these people were genuinely considering the possibility that I'd fabricated evidence of child abuse for personal gain. Who provided this information? I asked, though I was certain I already knew the answer. The source of the complaint isn't relevant to our investigation, Sharon replied smoothly. What matters is whether these allegations have merit and what impact they might have on your professional responsibilities. Dr. Martinez had remained silent during Sharon's presentation, but now he leaned forward with an expression of professional concern. Natalie, I've reviewed Tyler's medical records and the documentation from his emergency room visit. The injuries were consistent with a fall downstairs, but there are always questions when family dynamics are involved in pediatric trauma cases. His carefully worded statement was clearly designed to give the hospital plausible deniability while still casting doubt on my version of events. By framing Tyler's injuries as ambiguous rather than clearly indicating deliberate harm, Dr. Martinez was providing cover for whatever disciplinary action the administration had already decided to pursue. Dr. Martinez, you were present when Tyler told the social worker that his grandfather pushed him down the stairs. Quote, I said firmly. There was nothing ambiguous about his statement or about the circumstances that led to his injuries. Children's statements can be influenced by parental coaching or emotional trauma, Dr. Martinez replied, though he looked uncomfortable making the suggestion. It's not uncommon for family conflicts to color a child's perception of events. The implication that I'd coached Tyler to lie about his grandfather's violence was so offensive that I felt my professional composure begin to crack, but I forced myself to remain calm, knowing that any emotional response would be used as evidence of my instability or vindictiveness. I'd like to know specifically what allegations have been made and what evidence the hospital has to support disciplinary action, I said, directing my question to Sharon Webb. I also want to understand what professional standards you believe I've violated. Sharon consulted her notes again, clearly following a script that had been carefully prepared for this meeting. The allegations include falsifying medical histories, coaching a minor to provide false statements to authorities, and using your professional position to lend credibility to personal accusations against family members. Each accusation was designed to attack both my professional competence and my personal character, painting me as someone who would exploit my medical training and my relationship with my son to pursue a vindictive campaign against Frank. The sophistication of the attack suggested coordination between my mother and whoever had made the formal complaint to the hospital. "These are serious allegations," Nancy Fletcher added, though her tone suggested discomfort with the entire proceedings. "While we investigate, we think it would be appropriate for you to take administrative leave to avoid any appearance of impropriety." Administrative leave was effectively suspension without pay, disguised in language that made it sound voluntary and temporary. But we all knew that once I was removed from my position, the hospital would be under no pressure to restore me quickly or fairly, especially if additional complaints or pressure continued to be applied. "I won't be taking administrative leave for doing my job correctly and protecting my son from violence," I said firmly. "If the hospital chooses to discipline me for reporting child abuse, then you'll be explaining that decision to state regulators and federal investigators who take retaliation against mandated reporters very seriously." The threat wasn't empty. Robert Chang had already briefed me on the legal protections for healthcare workers who report suspected child abuse, and the hospital's exposure to liability if they took disciplinary action in connection with my report about Tyler's injuries. Dr. Martinez and Nancy Fletcher exchanged glances, and I could see that they were beginning to understand the legal complexities of what they'd been asked to do. Sharon Webb, however, seemed determined to proceed with whatever plan had been set in motion. "We have an obligation to investigate any allegations of professional misconduct," Sharon said stubbornly. "The source of the complaint doesn't affect our responsibility to ensure that our staff members are maintaining appropriate professional standards." "The source of the complaint is absolutely relevant when it appears to be retaliation for reporting child abuse," I replied. "And if this hospital takes any disciplinary action against me in connection with Tyler's case, you'll be hearing from our attorney about violations of state and federal whistleblower protections." The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, with various attempts to pressure me into accepting voluntary leave or agreeing to limitations on my duties while the investigation proceeded. But the legal framework that protected mandated reporters was robust, and Robert Chang's preliminary contact with the hospital's legal department had clearly gotten their attention. Finally, Nancy Fletcher announced that they would need additional time to review the situation and consult with legal counsel before making any decisions about my employment status. It was a face-saving way of backing down from disciplinary action they couldn't legally justify, but it also meant that the threat would continue hanging over me indefinitely. When I left the hospital that afternoon, I felt emotionally drained, but professionally vindicated. The attempt to undermine my career had failed, at least for now, but it had also demonstrated the lengths to which my mother was willing to go to protect Frank and punish me for refusing to drop charges. The next assault came from an unexpected direction and was far more personal than professional retaliation. Tyler and I were grocery shopping at the Safeway, near our apartment complex, when we encountered Stephanie in the produce section. She was dressed in her usual stylish attire, but her face looked drawn and tired in a way that suggested the family crisis was taking its toll on everyone. "Natalie," she said quietly, glancing around nervously as if she were afraid of being overheard. "Can we talk for a minute?" Tyler was examining apples with the serious concentration that children bring to important decisions, so I moved a few feet away with Stephanie while keeping my son within sight. Her nervous energy and furtive manner suggested that this wasn't a chance encounter, but a planned approach designed to catch me in a public setting where I'd be less likely to make a scene. "Stephanie, if you're here to deliver another message from Mom or try to convince me to drop charges against Dad, I'm not interested," I said preemptively. "It's not like that," she said quickly, though her expression suggested otherwise. "I'm worried about you, Nat, and about Tyler. This whole situation is spiraling out of control, and I think you need to consider what you're putting him through." The concern trolling was so transparent that I almost felt insulted by the attempt. Stephanie had never shown any meaningful interest in Tyler's well-being before, and her sudden maternal concern was clearly scripted rather than genuine. "Tyler is recovering well from being pushed down a flight of stairs by his grandfather," I said calmly. His physical injuries are healing, and he's in therapy to help him process the emotional trauma of being deliberately hurt by someone he trusted. But think about what this is doing to him long term, Stephanie pressed, her voice taking on a pleading quality. Having his grandfather arrested, seeing the family torn apart, dealing with all the legal stuff, that's going to affect him for the rest of his life. The victim blaming was so familiar that I could have predicted every word of Stephanie's argument. Tyler was being harmed by the consequences of Frank's actions, not by Frank's actions themselves. The legal proceedings were traumatic, not the violence that had precipitated them. The family was being torn apart by my insistence on accountability, not by Frank's assault on a child. You know what's going to affect Tyler for the rest of his life? I replied, learning that family members who claim to love him will defend the person who hurt him rather than protecting him from further harm. Learning that violence is acceptable as long as the perpetrator has enough institutional power to avoid consequences. Stephanie's expression shifted from fake concern to genuine frustration, and I could see her carefully prepared talking points falling apart as she realized I wasn't going to be manipulated by appeals to Tyler's well-being. Derek's career is being affected by this, she said, dropping the pretense of concern for Tyler and moving to more direct threats. Mom says there are questions being raised about his security clearance because of the criminal charges against Dad. Is your need for revenge really worth destroying your brother's future? The revelation that Derek's military advancement was genuinely at risk added a new dimension to the family pressure campaign. My mother wasn't just threatening hypothetical consequences. She was allowing real damage to occur to her golden child's career in order to increase the stakes of my decision to pursue justice for Tyler. Derek's security clearance is being affected because Mom chose to use military resources to intimidate witnesses in a criminal case, I said firmly. She created the security risk when she sent MPs to my apartment to threaten me on behalf of someone who assaulted a child. That's not fair, and you know it, Stephanie replied, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself and glanced around the produce section. Mom was just trying to help you understand the bigger picture. She wasn't threatening you. The gaslighting was so automatic that I wondered if Stephanie even realized she was doing it. In her mind, my mother's use of military personnel to deliver threats about the consequences of pursuing charges against Frank had been transformed into helpful guidance about complex family dynamics. Stephanie, I need you to listen to me very carefully, I said, lowering my voice to force her to lean in closer. Frank deliberately pushed my 8-year-old son down a flight of stairs, hard enough to require stitches and medical treatment. That is a crime, regardless of family relationships or military rank or career concerns. And if you or anyone else in this family continues to suggest that Tyler deserved what happened to him, you'll be hearing from my attorney. The direct threat seemed to shock Stephanie out of her manipulative script, and for a moment, I saw something that might have been genuine remorse flicker across her face. But it was quickly replaced by the defensive anger that had characterized all of my family's responses to this crisis. You're destroying everything, she said quietly. The family, Derek's career, Dad's reputation, all because you can't let go of an accident that happened when Tyler was being disrespectful. It wasn't an accident, I said firmly. And Tyler wasn't being disrespectful. He was being an 8-year-old child who asked his grandfather why he was angry. That question didn't justify violence, and nothing Tyler could have said or done would have justified Frank pushing him down those stairs. I called Tyler over and began loading our groceries into the cart, signaling the end of the conversation. Stephanie stood there for a moment longer, clearly struggling with whether to make another attempt at persuasion, but eventually walked away without saying goodbye. The encounter left me feeling sad rather than angry. Stephanie had been Frank's favorite throughout our childhood, protected from his worst impulses by her position as the baby of the family and her innate ability to charm her way out of trouble. She'd never experienced the full force of his violence or my mother's cold manipulation, and she genuinely seemed to believe that family loyalty should trump personal safety and legal accountability. But her willingness to blame Tyler for his own victimization, to dismiss Frank's violence as an accident, and to prioritize Derek's career over a child's well-being demonstrated how completely the family's toxic dynamics had shaped her worldview. She wasn't just enabling abuse. She was perpetuating it by refusing to acknowledge that it had occurred. That evening, while Tyler worked on homework at the kitchen table, I received a call from an unknown number with a Virginia area code. The voice on the other end was professional and courteous, but the message was unmistakably threatening. "Mrs. Brooks, this is Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell from the Pentagon Inspector General's office. I'm calling to inform you that allegations have been made regarding your possible misuse of military information and resources in connection with personal legal proceedings." The accusation was so absurd that I almost hung up, assuming it was some kind of prank call. But the caller's knowledge of specific details about Tyler's case and my family relationships suggested that this was another legitimate institutional attack orchestrated by my mother. "Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, I'm a civilian nurse with no access to military information or resources," I said carefully. "I'm not sure what allegations could possibly have been made about my conduct. The allegations suggest that you may have used your family relationships to gain access to sensitive information about military personnel and facilities, which you've then shared with civilian authorities to support personal legal claims," she replied, reading from what sounded like prepared notes. The sophistication of the accusation was impressive. By framing my cooperation with Tyler's legal case as potential espionage or security violations, my mother had created another avenue for institutional retaliation while making me appear to be a security risk rather than a victim of family violence. "I've shared no military information with anyone," I said firmly. "I've reported my father's assault on my son to appropriate civilian authorities, as required by law. If someone has suggested otherwise, they're lying. These are serious allegations that require investigation," Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell continued. "I wanted to inform you that federal investigators may need to interview you about your access to and use of any military information or resources." The call was clearly designed to intimidate me with the prospect of federal investigation and potential charges related to national security. But it also demonstrated that my mother was willing to make false accusations and waste government resources in order to pressure me into dropping charges against Frank. After hanging up, I immediately called Robert Chang and reported the contact from the Pentagon Inspector General's office. His response was swift and decisive. Within an hour, he'd contacted federal authorities to report what appeared to be abuse of military investigative resources for personal retaliation. "Your mother is digging herself deeper into legal trouble with every move she makes," Robert told me during our phone conversation. "Using military personnel and resources to intimidate civilians reporting child abuse is a federal crime. And now she's added false allegations to military investigators to the list of charges she could face." The irony wasn't lost on me. In her desperation to protect Frank from the consequences of his violence, my mother was committing increasingly serious crimes that could end her own military career and result in criminal charges. But she seemed willing to risk everything rather than acknowledge that Frank had deliberately hurt Tyler and deserved to be held accountable. The escalating institutional attacks were taking their toll on Tyler and me, but they were also generating documentation and evidence that strengthened our legal position. Every threatening phone call, every attempt at professional retaliation, every misuse of military resources created additional grounds for federal charges against my mother and her associates. More importantly, the pattern of retaliation was making it clear to outside observers that this wasn't a simple family dispute or misunderstanding. The coordinated institutional response to Tyler's assault case demonstrated consciousness of guilt and a sophisticated effort to avoid accountability through intimidation and abuse of power. Dr. Sarah Kim, the therapist I'd found to help Tyler process the trauma of Frank's assault, was particularly helpful in documenting the impact of the ongoing intimidation campaign on Tyler's mental health and recovery. Her clinical notes provided professional assessment of how the family's retaliation was affecting a child who was trying to heal from deliberate violence. "Tyler is showing remarkable resilience," Dr. Kim told me during one of our consultation sessions. "But the ongoing family conflict and adult behaviors he's witnessing are clearly causing additional stress and confusion about safety and trust." Her observations reinforced my determination to see the legal process through to completion, regardless of the personal costs. Tyler needed to see that adults who hurt children faced consequences, that institutional power couldn't erase evidence of wrongdoing, and that his mother would fight to protect him even when that fight meant losing family relationships and facing professional retaliation. The third week after Frank's assault brought an unexpected development that changed the entire trajectory of the case. Linda Torres, the social worker who had been assigned to Tyler's case, called me with news that was both encouraging and deeply disturbing. "Natalie, we've received additional reports about Frank Kellerman's behavior toward children," she said without preamble. 2 other families have come forward with similar incidents involving excessive force and inappropriate discipline. The revelation that there were other victims confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. Tyler's assault wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of violence toward children that had been covered up or minimized by family members and institutional connections. What kind of incidents? I asked, though I dreaded hearing the details. One involves a neighbor's child who was injured during a birthday party at your parents' house last year, Linda explained. The parents were told it was an accident, but their daughter recently disclosed that Mr. Kellerman deliberately pushed her into a glass table after she spilled something on his chair. The image of Frank attacking another child, another family being told to minimize his violence, another pattern of cover-up and denial, made me feel physically sick. But it also meant that Tyler and I weren't alone in facing the institutional pressure campaign designed to protect Frank from accountability. The second case involves your nephew, Derek's son Michael, Linda continued. His mother contacted us after hearing about Tyler's case. She says there were multiple incidents of excessive force and inappropriate punishment, but Derek and your mother convinced her not to report them. The revelation that my own brother's child had been victimized by Frank, and that Derek had participated in covering up those incidents, added another layer of horror to an already devastating situation. It also explained Derek's intense investment in protecting Frank and avoiding legal scrutiny that might expose his own failures to protect his son. Both families are willing to cooperate with the investigation and provide testimony about their experiences, Linda told me. This is no longer just about Tyler's assault. It's about a pattern of child abuse that's been systematically covered up by people with institutional power. The expansion of the case from a single incident to a pattern of abuse changed everything. Frank would now face multiple charges involving multiple victims, and my mother's retaliation campaign would be viewed as obstruction of justice in a broader investigation of child abuse, rather than just family conflict over a single incident. More importantly, Tyler would know that other children had faced similar violence, and that his courage in telling the truth had helped protect them from future harm. He wouldn't have to carry the burden of being the only victim or the only witness to Frank's violent behavior. That night, as I helped Tyler with his bedtime routine, I tried to explain in age-appropriate terms that other children had also been hurt by Grandpa Frank, and that Tyler's bravery in telling the truth was helping to protect them. "So I'm not the only one?" Tyler asked, his voice small but somehow relieved. "No, sweetheart, you're not the only one," I confirmed. "And because you were brave enough to tell the truth about what happened, other children will be safer now." Tyler nodded solemnly, processing this information with the remarkable adaptability that children possess. But I could see in his expression a growing understanding that the adults in his family had failed not just him, but other children as well. As I tucked him into bed that night, Tyler looked up at me with serious eyes and said, "Mommy, I'm glad we left that house, even if it makes some people angry." His simple statement captured everything I'd been struggling to articulate about our situation. Yes, pursuing justice for Tyler had cost us family relationships and subjected us to institutional retaliation, but it had also removed us from a toxic environment where violence toward children was normalized and covered up, where institutional power was used to protect perpetrators rather than victims. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt genuinely hopeful about our future. The legal case was stronger than ever, with multiple victims and clear evidence of systematic abuse and cover-up. The retaliation campaign was backfiring by generating additional criminal charges against my mother and her associates. And Tyler was healing, both physically and emotionally, in an environment where his safety was the primary concern. The battle was far from over, but we were winning it, one documented threat, one additional victim, one moment of Tyler's increasing confidence at a time. And tomorrow would bring new opportunities to continue building the evidence that would finally hold Frank accountable for his violence, while protecting other children from experiencing what Tyler had endured. The federal task force arrived at my mother's office on a Tuesday morning in February, 3 months after Tyler's assault. Special Agent Rebecca Torres from the FBI and Agent Michael Chen from the Department of Defense Office of Inspector General had coordinated their approach with the precision that my mother herself would have appreciated. Carmen called me at work to tell me that she'd seen the news coverage of military personnel being escorted from the Pentagon in handcuffs, and my phone had been buzzing with messages ever since. I was in the middle of administering medication to a 7-year-old patient with pneumonia when my supervisor approached with an expression I couldn't immediately read. Nancy Fletcher had been walking on eggshells around me since the hospital's failed attempt at disciplinary action, clearly aware that any appearance of retaliation would result in legal consequences for the institution. "Natalie, there's a call for you at the nurses' station," Nancy said quietly. "It's from an Agent Torres with the FBI. She says it's regarding the federal investigation into military personnel." The words sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system, though I couldn't tell whether it was excitement or terror. For months, Robert Chang had been telling me that my mother's escalating retaliation would eventually trigger federal attention, but the reality of federal agents actually taking action felt surreal and overwhelming. I finished with my patient and walked to the nurses' station on unsteady legs, aware that my colleagues were watching with barely concealed curiosity. The pediatric ward had been buzzing with gossip about my family situation ever since the administration's failed disciplinary action, and the arrival of FBI calls was only going to intensify the speculation. Agent Torres's voice was professional and measured when I picked up the phone. "Mrs. Brooks, I'm calling to inform you that we've executed search warrants and made arrests in connection with the investigation into military personnel who may have abused their positions to obstruct justice and intimidate witnesses in your son's assault case." The formal language couldn't disguise the magnitude of what she was telling me. Federal agents had determined that my mother's actions constituted serious crimes worthy of arrest and prosecution. The institutional power that my family had wielded to protect Frank and intimidate me had become the very evidence that would destroy them. General Patricia Kellerman is currently in federal custody on charges of abuse of office, witness intimidation, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Agent Torres continued. "We'll need to schedule an interview with you to document the intimidation tactics used against you and your son." The news that my mother was in jail, stripped of her rank and uniform, facing federal charges that could end her career and result in years of prison time, should have felt like vindication. Instead, it felt like watching a building collapse that I'd grown up inside, even though that building had never been safe or stable. "What about the others?" I managed to ask. "The military police who came to my apartment? The people who made false reports to my employer?" "Several individuals are facing charges," Agent Torres replied diplomatically. "The investigation is ongoing, but I can tell you that we've identified a systematic pattern of abuse of military resources and authority to interfere with civilian law enforcement and judicial proceedings." After hanging up, I sat in the nurses' station staring at my hands while the implications of the federal arrests sank in. My mother, who had spent 30 years building a career based on honor, service, and institutional loyalty, had thrown it all away to protect a man who pushed children downstairs. The irony was profound and tragic in equal measure. Carmen arrived at the hospital during my lunch break, having left her own shift early to check on me after seeing the news reports. She found me in the cafeteria pushing food around my plate without eating, still processing the morning's developments. "Holy shit, Nat," Carmen said without preamble, sliding into the chair across from me. "Your mom got arrested by the FBI. It's all over the news. They're calling it one of the biggest corruption scandals at the Pentagon in years." The media attention was something I hadn't considered, but it made sense given my mother's high rank and the nature of the charges. Pentagon generals being arrested for obstruction of justice was significant news, especially when it involved using military resources to intimidate civilians reporting child abuse. "How are you feeling about all this?" Carmen asked gently, clearly recognizing that my emotional response to my mother's arrest would be complicated, regardless of how justified the charges might be. "I don't know," I admitted honestly. "Part of me feels vindicated that someone finally recognized how wrong her behavior was. But part of me feels sad that it came to this. She destroyed her entire career to protect someone who hurt Tyler. She made her choices," Carmen said firmly. "You didn't force her to send military police to your apartment or make false reports to federal investigators. She did that because she thought her rank and connections would protect her from consequences." Carmen was right, but that didn't make it easier to watch the complete destruction of my family's public image and institutional standing. The news reports were already describing Frank's assault on Tyler and the subsequent cover-up attempt, turning our private trauma into public scandal. More concerning was the potential impact on Tyler, who was too young to understand the complexities of federal investigations, but old enough to recognize that something major was happening with his extended family. I'd been trying to shield him from most of the legal proceedings, but arrests and news coverage were harder to hide. The afternoon brought another unexpected development, when Linda Torres called to inform me that Derek had requested a meeting with prosecutors to discuss his potential cooperation with the federal investigation. My brother, who had spent months defending my mother's actions and pressuring me to drop charges against Frank, was apparently ready to provide evidence against both of them in exchange for leniency. Derek's attorney contacted our office this morning, Linda explained. He's claiming that he was coerced into participating in the intimidation campaign and that he has evidence of additional criminal conduct by both your mother and father. The revelation that Derek was willing to betray my mother after months of loyal service to her agenda was shocking, but not entirely surprising. Military officers were trained to adapt to changing tactical situations, and Derek had clearly recognized that his mother's position was no longer defensible. "What kind of evidence does he have?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "He's claiming to have recordings of conversations where your mother discussed using military contacts to pressure your employer and interfere with the criminal investigation," Linda replied. "He also says he has documentation of financial payments made to civilians who filed false reports about you." The scope of my mother's corruption was apparently far broader than even the federal investigators had initially suspected. She hadn't just abused her military position, she'd created an organized conspiracy involving bribery, false statements, and systematic obstruction of justice. But Derek's sudden willingness to cooperate also raised questions about his own culpability and motivations. He'd participated enthusiastically in the family's campaign against me for months, pressuring me to drop charges and defending Frank's violence. His conversion to whistleblower status seemed more strategic than moral. That evening, as Tyler and I shared dinner in our small apartment, I tried to find age-appropriate ways to explain that some of his family members were in trouble with the law because of how they'd responded to his assault. It was a delicate balance between honesty and protection, wanting him to understand that justice was being served without exposing him to details that might be traumatizing. "Tyler, you know how Grandpa Frank hurt you, and then some other people tried to stop Mommy from getting help from the police?" I began carefully. Tyler nodded, his expression serious but calm. He'd been remarkably resilient throughout this entire ordeal, though Dr. Kim had warned me that children often process trauma in delayed waves that could emerge months or years later. "Well, those people who tried to stop Mommy broke some very important rules, and now they're in trouble with the police and the courts," I continued. "That means they can't try to stop us from keeping you safe anymore." "Is Grandma Pat going to jail?" Tyler asked directly, using the nickname he'd always used for my mother. The question was harder to answer than I'd expected. Despite everything my mother had done, Tyler had never experienced her worst behavior directly. To him, she was still the grandmother who had given him birthday presents and let him help with holiday cooking, not the Pentagon General who had orchestrated a campaign of intimidation and obstruction. "Grandma Pat made some very bad choices when she tried to protect Grandpa Frank instead of protecting you," I said honestly. "Now judges and police officers have to decide what happens because of those bad choices." Tyler processed this information with the same matter-of-fact acceptance he'd shown throughout the legal proceedings. But then he asked a question that caught me completely off guard. "Mommy, why did they want to protect Grandpa Frank instead of me?" The simple, heartbreaking question went to the core of everything that had happened. An 8-year-old child couldn't understand the complex dynamics of institutional power, family loyalty, and abuse enablement that had shaped my family's response to his assault. He could only understand that adults who claimed to love him had chosen to protect the person who hurt him. "I don't know, sweetheart," I admitted, because any other answer would have been a lie. Sometimes grown-ups make choices that don't make sense, especially when they're scared or confused. But that doesn't mean their choices were right. "I'm glad you protected me," Tyler said simply, returning his attention to his dinner. His uncomplicated gratitude was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. Tyler shouldn't have needed protection from his own family members, but he was mature enough to recognize and appreciate that I'd chosen his safety over family harmony. The next morning brought news that Frank had finally been arrested on multiple charges of child abuse, assault, and endangering the welfare of minors. The additional victims whose cases had been uncovered during the investigation had provided compelling evidence of a pattern of violence that couldn't be dismissed as isolated incidents or misunderstandings. Robert Chang called to inform me that Frank's arrest had been coordinated with my mother's federal charges to prevent any possibility of intimidation or obstruction. With my mother in federal custody and facing her own serious charges, she was no longer in a position to use institutional resources to protect Frank or retaliate against witnesses. This is the breakthrough we've been working toward, Robert told me during our phone conversation. With multiple victims willing to testify and clear evidence of systematic cover-up, Frank is looking at significant prison time, even if he pleads guilty. The legal vindication was satisfying, but what mattered more was the protection it provided for Tyler and the other children Frank had victimized. As long as Frank remained free and protected by institutional power, there was always the possibility that he could hurt other children or escalate his retaliation against those who had exposed his violence. The media coverage of Frank's arrest was less extensive than the Pentagon corruption story, but it was thorough enough to establish a public record of his crimes and the family's attempts to cover them up. Local news stations interviewed neighbors who expressed shock at the allegations, though some admitted they'd witnessed concerning behavior during community events. More importantly, the publicity encouraged additional victims to come forward. Linda Torres called that afternoon to inform me that 3 more families had contacted authorities with reports of inappropriate conduct by Frank during various social gatherings and family events. The pattern is becoming undeniable, Linda explained. Frank Kellerman has been using his position as a military family patriarch to intimidate children and cover up abusive behavior for years. Your son's case was just the most recent and best documented incident. The expansion of the case to include additional victims strengthened the legal proceedings, but also confirmed my worst fears about Frank's behavior and my family's willingness to enable it. How many children had been hurt over the years? How many families had been pressured to remain silent or convinced that reporting Frank's violence would be pointless or harmful? Tyler's therapy session that week focused on helping him understand that his courage in telling the truth had protected other children from similar harm. Dr. Kim was skilled at helping children process complex situations without overwhelming them with adult concerns or responsibilities. Tyler, do you remember when we talked about how telling the truth about what happened to you was brave and important? Dr. Kim asked during their session. Tyler nodded, sitting cross-legged on the floor with his favorite therapy toy, a stuffed dragon that he'd named Courage. Well, because you were brave enough to tell the truth, some other children who were hurt by the same person are also getting help now. Dr. Kim continued. Your truth-telling helped protect them. Tyler considered this information seriously, hugging Courage against his chest. So when bad things happen, telling the truth helps other people too? That's exactly right, Dr. Kim confirmed. Sometimes telling the truth is hard or scary, but it's one of the most important ways we can help keep people safe. The lesson was valuable for Tyler's development and healing, but it also reinforced my own sense of vindication about pursuing charges despite family pressure. Tyler was learning that truth-telling and justice-seeking were moral imperatives rather than acts of betrayal or revenge. The trial preparation process was intensive and emotionally draining, requiring detailed documentation of every incident, threat, and attempt at intimidation over the preceding months. Federal prosecutors were building cases against both my mother and Frank that would require testimony from multiple witnesses and extensive evidence of systematic abuse and cover-up. Agent Torres interviewed Tyler in a child-friendly environment with Dr. Kim present to provide emotional support. The federal agents were experienced in working with child witnesses and used techniques designed to minimize trauma while still gathering legally admissible testimony. Tyler's account of Frank's assault was clear and consistent with his previous statements to police, medical personnel, and social workers. But what struck me most was his calm confidence in describing what had happened. He was no longer the frightened, confused child who had tumbled down those basement stairs. He was a young person who understood his own truth and felt supported in telling it. The defense attorneys for both my mother and Frank attempted various strategies to minimize their clients' culpability and shift responsibility to external factors. Frank's lawyers suggested that his behavior was the result of undiagnosed PTSD from his military service decades earlier. My mother's attorney argued that she'd been manipulated by Frank into making poor decisions that were out of character for an otherwise distinguished officer. But the evidence of systematic, deliberate conduct over an extended period made these defenses difficult to sustain. The recordings Derek had provided showed my mother calmly planning illegal activities and discussing the use of military resources for personal purposes. The multiple child victims demonstrated that Frank's violence was targeted and intentional rather than impulsive or stress-related. The plea negotiations were complex and involved coordination between federal prosecutors handling my mother's case and state prosecutors pursuing charges against Frank. Both defendants faced significant prison time if convicted at trial, creating incentives for cooperation and admissions of guilt. Frank ultimately pleaded guilty to multiple counts of child abuse and assault in exchange for a sentence recommendation of 8 to 12 years in state prison. The plea agreement required him to register as a sex offender and prohibited him from unsupervised contact with minors for the rest of his life. My mother's case was more complicated because of the federal charges and the national security implications of her conduct. She eventually pleaded guilty to abuse of office and obstruction of justice in exchange for a 10-year federal prison sentence and forfeiture of all military benefits and pension rights. The sentencing hearings provided opportunities for victim impact statements, and I chose to speak on behalf of Tyler and the other children who had been harmed by Frank's violence and my mother's cover-up. Standing at the podium in federal court, facing the judge who would determine my mother's fate, I felt the weight of everything that had led to this moment. Your Honor, my son Tyler was 8 years old when his grandfather deliberately pushed him down a flight of stairs hard enough to require emergency medical treatment. I began, my voice steady despite the emotional intensity of the moment. But the assault itself was only the beginning of the trauma he experienced. I described the family's immediate response to Tyler's injuries, the attempts to blame him for his own victimization, and the systematic campaign of intimidation designed to prevent accountability. I explained how institutional power had been weaponized against a child and his mother, and how that abuse of power had enabled continued harm to other children. Tyler has shown remarkable resilience and courage throughout this ordeal. I continued. He told the truth about what happened to him even when adults he trusted tried to convince him that his truth didn't matter. He participated in this legal process even when it meant facing criticism and retaliation from his own family members. The judge listened attentively, occasionally taking notes as I described the broader impact of Frank's violence and my mother's obstruction. When I finished, he thanked me for my statement and acknowledged the courage it had taken for Tyler and me to pursue justice, despite family pressure and institutional intimidation. During Frank's sentencing hearing at the state courthouse, I was joined by parents of the other child victims who had chosen to provide impact statements. Hearing their accounts of how Frank's violence had affected their families reinforced the significance of Tyler's decision to tell the truth about what had happened to him. One mother described how her daughter had suffered nightmares and anxiety attacks for months after Frank's assault, and how the family's trust in authority figures had been shattered by the attempts to cover up his behavior. Another father explained how his son had become withdrawn and fearful after being hurt by Frank, and how the child's recovery had been complicated by adults who suggested he was lying or exaggerating. The pattern of harm was clear and undeniable. Frank hadn't just physically injured multiple children. He'd violated their sense of safety and trust in the adults who were supposed to protect them. The family and institutional response had compounded that trauma by suggesting that the children were somehow responsible for their own victimization. When the judge announced Frank's sentence of 10 years in state prison, I felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and hope. Relief that Frank would be unable to hurt other children for the foreseeable future. Sadness that it had taken multiple child victims and a federal investigation to achieve basic accountability. Hope that Tyler and the other children would be able to heal, knowing that their truth had been heard and validated by the justice system. The aftermath of the sentencing brought unexpected challenges as well as closure. Media coverage of the cases had attracted attention from child advocacy organizations and legal scholars interested in the intersection of military culture and child abuse. I found myself being contacted by researchers and advocates who wanted to understand how institutional power had been used to enable and cover up violence against children. Some of these contacts were helpful and supportive, offering resources for Tyler's continued healing and connecting me with other families who had faced similar challenges. Others felt exploitative, seeking to use our story for academic research or media projects without consideration for Tyler's privacy or well-being. Tyler's therapy with Dr. Kim continued throughout the legal proceedings and their aftermath, helping him process not just the original trauma of Frank's assault, but also the complex family dynamics and public attention that had followed. Dr. Kim was particularly skilled at helping Tyler understand that the adult conflicts and consequences weren't his responsibility or fault. Tyler, sometimes when children tell the truth about being hurt, it causes a lot of grown-up problems and arguments, Dr. Kim explained during one of their sessions. But those problems existed before you told the truth. You didn't create them by being honest about what happened to you. Tyler's emotional development throughout this period was remarkable to witness. He was learning sophisticated concepts about justice, truth-telling, and moral courage that most children don't encounter until much later in their development. But he was also learning them in the context of genuine support and validation, rather than abstract theory. The financial costs of the legal proceedings had been substantial, despite Robert Chang's willingness to work on a contingency basis for much of the case. Court fees, expert witness costs, therapy expenses, and lost income from work disruptions had strained our modest budget significantly. But there were also unexpected financial benefits. A victim's compensation fund provided reimbursement for Tyler's medical expenses and therapy costs. A civil settlement with my mother's military insurance covered additional damages. And a small foundation focused on supporting families affected by military-related abuse provided grants for Tyler's continued education and counseling. More importantly, Tyler and I had gained something that couldn't be measured in financial terms, a sense of safety and agency that had been missing from our relationship with my extended family. We no longer had to navigate complex family dynamics that required minimizing or excusing harmful behavior. We no longer had to protect ourselves from people who claimed to love us while enabling our victimization. The quiet aftermath of the legal victories was in many ways more significant than the dramatic courtroom proceedings. Tyler could sleep peacefully without worrying about unexpected visits from intimidating relatives. I could focus on my nursing career without fear of professional retaliation for protecting my son. We could build relationships based on mutual respect and genuine care, rather than family obligation and institutional hierarchy. Tyler's 8th birthday, which occurred 3 weeks after Frank's sentencing, was the first family celebration he'd ever experienced, where his safety and happiness were the primary concerns. Carmen and her family joined us for a small party in our apartment, along with Dr. Kim and a few of Tyler's school friends. There were no complex family dynamics to navigate, no adults whose approval we needed to maintain, no underlying tensions about loyalty or hierarchy. Watching Tyler blow out his birthday candles surrounded by people who genuinely cared about his well-being, I realized that we'd lost a family but gained something far more valuable: the freedom to create relationships based on love and respect, rather than fear and obligation. The legal proceedings had provided justice and protection, but the real victory was the quiet peace of Tyler's laughter, as he opened presents from people who celebrated him without reservation or condition. The final chapter of this ordeal was still being written, but its conclusion was no longer in doubt. Tyler was safe, Frank was in prison, my mother was facing the consequences of her choices, and we were free to build a future that prioritized truth, safety, and genuine love over institutional power and family loyalty. The 8-year-old boy who had tumbled down those basement stairs had become a young person who understood that his voice mattered, that truth-telling was courage, and that justice was worth pursuing even when it required sacrificing relationships that had never truly served his best interests. That transformation was worth every challenge we'd faced and every relationship we'd lost along the way. 2 years after the sentencing, Tyler and I stood in the conference room of the newly established Tyler Brooks Foundation for Child Protection, watching as our attorney Robert Chang signed the final incorporation papers. The foundation had emerged from an unexpected source, a class action settlement involving dozens of military families whose children had been victimized by various forms of institutional abuse and cover-up. The settlement had been massive, recognizing a pattern of military culture that had protected perpetrators while silencing victims across multiple installations and decades. Tyler's case had become the catalyst that exposed systematic failures in military family services and oversight, leading to congressional hearings and policy reforms that affected thousands of families. "This foundation will ensure that other children don't have to fight alone like you did," I told Tyler as he carefully placed his handprint in the bronze cast that would become part of the foundation's lobby. At 10 years old, he understood the significance of what we were building, even if he couldn't fully grasp the legal complexities that had made it possible. Tyler had grown into a thoughtful, articulate child who spoke regularly to groups of military families about the importance of reporting abuse and seeking help when adults failed to protect them. His presentations were age-appropriate but powerful, focusing on simple messages about truth-telling, personal safety, and the difference between family loyalty and enabling harmful behavior. Dr. Kim had initially been concerned about Tyler's public speaking engagements, worried that they might interfere with his healing or place inappropriate responsibility on him for adult problems. But Tyler himself had requested opportunities to share his story after meeting other child victims during the legal proceedings, and his presentations seemed to strengthen rather than undermine his sense of agency and purpose. The Foundation's first initiative was a training program for military family service providers, teaching them to recognize signs of institutional pressure that might prevent families from reporting abuse or seeking help. The program had been piloted at 3 major military installations and was already showing promising results in increased reporting and improved support for victimized families. Carmen had taken a leave of absence from her nursing position to serve as the Foundation's program director, bringing her medical expertise and natural warmth to the delicate work of supporting traumatized families. She'd moved her own family closer to our new offices in Arlington, creating a support network that Tyler and I had never experienced during our years of isolation and conflict. The Foundation's lobby displayed photographs and stories from families who had overcome institutional pressure to seek justice for their children. Tyler's photo was prominently featured, showing him at age 8, with his hospital bracelet still visible, alongside a current photo of him cutting the ribbon at the Foundation's opening ceremony. But the most meaningful display was a collection of letters from children who had found the courage to report abuse after hearing Tyler's presentations or reading about his case. Their handwritten notes, carefully edited to protect their privacy, testified to the ripple effects of one child's decision to tell the truth, despite adult pressure to remain silent. Frank had been denied parole after serving only 2 years of his sentence, partly due to his continued refusal to accept responsibility for his actions or participate in rehabilitation programs. Prison reports indicated that he maintained his innocence and blamed Tyler for the destruction of the family, attitudes that correctional officials viewed as evidence of ongoing risk to public safety. The denial of parole had been difficult news to process, not because I wanted Frank released, but because it confirmed that he remained fundamentally unchanged by the consequences of his actions. 2 years in prison hadn't generated remorse, empathy, or understanding of the harm he'd caused to multiple children. Tyler's reaction to the parole denial had been characteristically mature and thoughtful. "I hope someday Grandpa Frank understands why what he did was wrong," he'd said after I explained the decision. "But I'm glad other kids are safe while he's still learning." My mother's federal prison sentence was being served at a minimum security facility in Pennsylvania, where she was reportedly teaching literacy classes to other inmates and maintaining the rigid self-discipline that had characterized her military career. She'd written several letters requesting contact with Tyler and me, but they'd all been returned unopened, per our attorney's advice and Tyler's own expressed preferences. The letters had created complex emotions for me, representing the final remnants of a mother-daughter relationship that had been fundamentally poisoned by her choices during Tyler's crisis. Part of me wondered whether she'd experienced genuine remorse or growth during her incarceration, but a larger part recognized that Tyler's well-being had to take precedence over my curiosity about her emotional journey. Derek had received a suspended sentence and reduction in rank in exchange for his cooperation with federal investigators, but his military career had been effectively ended by the scandal. He'd moved to Colorado with his family and was working as a private security consultant, apparently having learned from his father's mistakes about the importance of protecting children from violent adults. His wife had reached out through intermediaries to express gratitude for Tyler's courage in exposing Frank's pattern of abuse, acknowledging that their own son Michael had suffered damage that they were still working to address through therapy and family counseling. The admission that Michael had been victimized had been painful to hear, but also validating of the decision to pursue justice despite family pressure. Stephanie had largely disappeared from our lives after the trials, though mutual acquaintances reported that she'd moved to California and was working in real estate while avoiding any public discussion of the family scandal. Her absence was probably healthier for everyone involved, given her continued inability to acknowledge Frank's culpability or understand the harm caused by the family's enabling behavior. The media attention surrounding our case had gradually diminished, but it had generated lasting changes in how military families approached issues of child protection and institutional accountability. New policies required independent investigation of abuse allegations involving military personnel, and specialized training had been implemented for military police and family service providers. Tyler's school experiences had been complicated by the public nature of our legal battles, requiring careful coordination with teachers and administrators to protect his privacy while acknowledging the realities of his situation. But his academic performance had remained strong, and he'd developed friendships with children who valued his honesty and integrity rather than being intimidated by his history. His favorite subjects were science and creative writing, interests that seemed to reflect both analytical thinking and emotional processing skills that had been strengthened by his experiences with trauma and recovery. His teachers consistently described him as empathetic, responsible, and unusually mature in his interactions with both peers and adults. The financial settlement from the class action lawsuit had provided security that Tyler and I had never experienced, eliminating the constant stress of medical bills, legal fees, and potential retaliation that had shadowed our lives for years. But more importantly, it had provided resources to help other families facing similar challenges through the Foundation's support programs. Tyler had requested that a portion of his settlement be designated for college scholarships for children who had overcome abuse or institutional pressure, demonstrating a generosity and forward-thinking perspective that never failed to impress the adults around him. His understanding that education could be both healing and empowering reflected lessons learned through his own journey, from victim to advocate. The Foundation's counseling services had become particularly popular among military families who were struggling with the cultural barriers that often prevented them from seeking help for domestic violence or child abuse. The combination of clinical expertise and lived experience provided by our staff created an environment where families felt understood rather than judged for their complicated situations. Dr. Kim had joined the Foundation as our Chief Clinical Officer, bringing her specialized expertise in childhood trauma to bear on systemic problems that affected hundreds of military families. Her research on institutional betrayal and recovery had been published in several professional journals, contributing to academic understanding of how organizational cultures could either support or undermine child protection efforts. Tyler continued his weekly therapy sessions with Dr. Kim, though they now focused more on normal developmental challenges than trauma processing. He was learning to navigate typical childhood concerns like friendship dynamics and academic pressure, experiences that had been overshadowed during his earlier years by more serious threats to his safety and well-being. The therapy relationship had evolved into something more like mentorship, with Dr. Kim helping Tyler develop leadership skills and emotional intelligence that would serve him well in his advocacy work and future endeavors. She'd also been instrumental in helping him maintain appropriate boundaries between his personal healing and his public role as a survivor spokesperson. Tyler's relationship with his extended family remained permanently altered, but he developed strong connections with chosen family members who provided the love and support that blood relatives had failed to offer. Carmen's children had become like cousins to him, and several Foundation board members had taken on quasi-grandparent roles that filled the void left by Frank and my mother's choices. The Foundation's annual conference had become a major event in the military family services community, bringing together advocates, researchers, and survivors to share strategies for protecting children and supporting families affected by institutional abuse. Tyler typically delivered the opening address, speaking with confidence and clarity that belied his young age. His most recent speech had focused on the difference between secrecy and privacy, explaining how family secrets often protected harmful behavior, while healthy privacy protected individuals from unnecessary scrutiny. The distinction was sophisticated for a 10-year-old, but Tyler had lived the difference in ways that gave his words particular authority and impact. One of the Foundation's most successful programs was a peer support network for children who had testified in abuse cases or experienced retaliation for reporting harmful behavior. Tyler had suggested the program after meeting other child witnesses during our legal proceedings, recognizing that they faced unique challenges that weren't addressed by traditional counseling services. The peer support sessions were facilitated by trained therapists but driven by the children themselves, creating safe spaces where young people could share experiences and strategies without feeling judged or misunderstood by adults who hadn't faced similar challenges. Tyler was one of several youth leaders who helped newcomers feel welcome and supported in the group. My own career had evolved significantly since Tyler's assault, transitioning from bedside nursing to policy advocacy and program development within the Foundation. The combination of medical training and personal experience with institutional retaliation had prepared me for work that required both clinical knowledge and political sophistication. I'd testified before congressional subcommittees about the need for stronger protections for military families reporting abuse, and I'd consulted with law enforcement agencies about improving their responses to cases involving institutional pressure and intimidation. The work was emotionally demanding but deeply meaningful, turning our traumatic experiences into tools for preventing similar harm to other families. The congressional testimony had been particularly powerful, providing a public platform to describe how institutional power could be weaponized against children and their protective parents. The stark contrast between the formal hearing room and our modest apartment where Tyler had first disclosed Frank's violence had highlighted the importance of creating systems that amplified victim voices rather than silencing them. Tyler had accompanied me to some of these speaking engagements, providing compelling visual evidence of how children could thrive when their safety was prioritized over institutional convenience or family reputation. His presence at these events invariably shifted the focus from abstract policy discussions to concrete human impact, making it harder for officials to dismiss the importance of strong child protection measures. The Foundation's research division was documenting patterns of institutional abuse and cover-up across multiple military installations, creating comprehensive data about how organizational cultures could enable or prevent child victimization. The research was being used to develop evidence-based interventions and policy recommendations that addressed systemic rather than individual problems. Tyler had become fascinated by this research, often spending afternoons in the Foundation offices reviewing case files and helping staff identify patterns that might not be obvious to adult researchers. His perspective as a former victim provided insights that complemented professional expertise, contributing to more nuanced understanding of how children experienced institutional betrayal and recovery. The Foundation's legal clinic provided free representation for military families facing retaliation for reporting abuse or seeking accountability for institutional failures. Robert Chang had established the clinic after recognizing that many families lacked resources to challenge powerful institutions, even when they had strong legal claims. The clinic's success rate was impressive, winning significant settlements and policy changes that protected hundreds of families from experiences similar to what Tyler and I had endured. But more importantly, the clinic's existence had deterred some institutions from retaliating against families, knowing that their actions would face professional legal challenge rather than going unchallenged due to resource constraints. Tyler's college fund had grown substantially through speaking fees and book royalties from a children's book we'd co-authored about courage and truth-telling. The book had become popular in schools and therapy programs, providing age-appropriate language for discussing difficult topics like family secrets, institutional pressure, and personal safety. The book's success had surprised everyone involved, demonstrating significant demand for resources that helped children understand complex situations involving adult failures and systemic problems. Tyler had insisted that proceeds beyond his college expenses be donated to literacy programs in underserved communities, continuing his pattern of using personal benefits to support broader social good. Our apartment in Falls Church had eventually been replaced by a modest house in Arlington, chosen primarily for its proximity to the Foundation offices and Tyler's school. The house was comfortable but not ostentatious, reflecting our commitment to using settlement resources for meaningful purposes rather than lifestyle inflation. Tyler's bedroom walls were covered with certificates from speaking engagements, photos with other young advocates, and artwork created by children who had participated in Foundation programs. The display represented a childhood that had been shaped by unusual circumstances but filled with purpose and connection to community rather than isolation and fear. The basement of our new house had been converted into a playroom and study space, deliberately designed to be bright, welcoming, and safe. Tyler had specifically requested that we create positive associations with basement spaces, demonstrating his sophisticated understanding of how trauma could be processed and transformed through intentional action. Dr. Kim had praised Tyler's initiative in reimagining basement spaces, noting that it represented healthy integration of traumatic memories rather than avoidance or denial. The playroom had become a popular gathering space for Foundation events and Tyler's friendships, serving as concrete evidence that spaces associated with harm could be reclaimed and transformed. The Foundation's 5-year plan included expansion to civilian communities facing similar challenges with institutional abuse and cover-up, recognizing that military culture was only one context where power structures could be weaponized against children and protective parents. Tyler had been instrumental in developing this expansion strategy, insisting that the Foundation's mission should be as broad as possible. His vision for the Foundation's future included international programs addressing child protection in authoritarian contexts, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of how power operates across different cultural and political systems. The ambition was remarkable for a 10-year-old, but Tyler's experiences had provided unusual insight into how institutional authority could either protect or harm vulnerable individuals. Tyler's relationship with justice had evolved from personal experience to philosophical commitment, reflected in his interest in studying law and policy when he reached college age. He'd already begun reading simplified legal texts and attending court proceedings as an observer, developing expertise that would serve him well in future advocacy work. His understanding of legal systems was practical rather than theoretical, grounded in lived experience of how laws could either protect children or be manipulated to silence them. This perspective would make him an unusually effective advocate when he reached adulthood, combining professional knowledge with authentic understanding of victim experiences. The Foundation's impact measurement showed significant improvements in child protection outcomes at military installations where our training programs had been implemented. Reports of abuse had increased while cover-up incidents had decreased, suggesting that cultural change was possible when institutions committed to prioritizing child safety over reputation management. Tyler took particular pride in these statistics, understanding that they represented children who were safer because of choices he'd made years earlier to tell the truth about Frank's violence, despite family pressure to remain silent. The connection between his individual courage and systemic change provided powerful validation of the decision to pursue justice despite personal costs. As we prepared for the Foundation's 3rd annual conference, Tyler was working on a presentation about the long-term effects of institutional betrayal and recovery. His perspective as someone who had experienced both the trauma of abuse and the healing power of authentic support provided unique insights that complemented research presented by adult professionals. The presentation would focus on resilience factors that helped children overcome institutional failures, emphasizing the importance of having at least one adult who prioritized their safety over organizational loyalty. Tyler's analysis of his own recovery process had identified specific moments and relationships that had been crucial to his healing, information that could guide intervention strategies for other victimized children. Tyler's story had become a testament to the power of truth-telling and institutional accountability, but more importantly, it had become a blueprint for how children could be supported through the complex process of challenging powerful adults and organizations. His journey from frightened victim to confident advocate demonstrated that recovery was possible, even after the most serious betrayals by family and institutional authority. The Foundation's work continued to expand and evolve, driven by Tyler's vision of a world where children's safety took precedence over adult convenience and organizational reputation. His leadership in this work, despite his young age, provided hope that future generations would be better protected from the kinds of institutional failures that had nearly destroyed our family. Standing in the Foundation's lobby on the anniversary of Tyler's assault, watching him interact with newly arrived families seeking help, I was struck by how completely our lives had been transformed by his decision to tell the truth about what Frank had done to him. The frightened 8-year-old who had tumbled down those basement stairs had become a powerful advocate whose voice was changing policies and protecting children across the country. The journey had cost us family relationships and subjected us to years of legal battles and public scrutiny, but it had also given us purpose, community, and the satisfaction of knowing that other children were safer because of Tyler's courage. In the end, that trade had been worth every challenge we'd faced and every sacrifice we'd made along the way. Tyler's laughter echoed through the Foundation lobby as he showed a younger child how to add her handprint to our wall of courage, and I knew that we'd built something that would outlast both of us, a legacy of protection, truth-telling, and hope that would continue safeguarding children long after our own story had faded into history. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.